our YouTube viewers and everyone that is joining us here in Zoom. Thank you so much for being here. You are in for a real treat tonight with our quarterly Climate Science AMA. Tonight, we're going to jump right into tonight's topic, which is a little bit of a different twist on our focus, specifically on science and climate misinformation and how to counter that with the wonderful Dr. John Cook. John is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Climate Change Communication Research Hub at Monash University. His research focus is understanding and countering misinformation about climate change with an emphasis on using critical thinking to build resilience. In 2007, John founded Skeptical Science, a website that won the 2011 Australian Museum Eureka Prize for the advancement of climate change knowledge. John also co-authored the textbook for colleges, Climate Change, Examining the Facts and Climate Change Science, a Modern Synthesis, as well as the book Climate Change Denial, Heads in the Sand. In 2020, he also published the book Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, which applies critical thinking, inoculation research, and cartoons to engage and educate readers about climate misinformation. John recently released the Cranky Uncle game, and tonight he's giving us a special code for CCLers that I'll put in the chat here again, with the US Creative Agency Autonomy. And that game, I highly recommend it. I've already advanced to an advanced level myself, combines critical thinking, cartoons, and gamification to build players' resilience against misinformation. So with that, it is our esteemed honor, you're getting a lot of love already here in the chat, John, to have you join us tonight. I'm going to pass it to Dana, and the rest is history. So let's enjoy a wonderful AMA together, and thanks so much for being here.
Cool, thanks, Brett. Okay, so I guess we're gonna do a little bit of skeptical science history. So John, was it around, what, 2007 that you founded Skeptical Science?
Yeah, exactly, 2007.
Oh, I nailed it, nice. Okay, and I believe the story is that you were arguing with your father, who was a climate denier. Was it father or father-in-law?
Father-in-law. I also had arguments with my father, but we argue all the time anyway. But, yeah, it was my father-in-law at a family lunch started just throwing out all these climate myths, and at that point I didn't really know much about the topic. And then after lunch, he went off into his office and then came back with a printout, and it was a speech about climate change from Oklahoma Senator James Inhofe. I was like, it's a bit random, like we're in Australia getting speeches from some politician in America. Yeah. And I went away and read the speech and was surprised at just how little science was in the speech, but started researching the actual arguments, the few of them that he did make, and found that his arguments just had no scientific basis to them at all. And so, like any son-in-law that's strongly motivated to win the next argument with his father-in-law, and also as a very nerdy son-in-law, I started building a database of all the possible arguments that he might bring up, and then collecting the peer-reviewed science. This is way over the top in terms of preparing for a family lunch. Yeah, so just building this resource of climate myths and relevant published research about each myth. And then for me, probably the point of no return was when I started getting into online arguments about climate change as well, and finding that this resource was really useful for responding to various myths, in online forums. And eventually I realized that other people might find it a useful resource as well. So I just cleaned it up a bit and published it as the Skeptical Science website. And the idea of it from the very beginning, and still is, was just being an encyclopedic resource, explaining what the peer-reviewed science said about each of the different climate myths.
Yeah, and back in the early days, I was using it a lot because I was getting in, the arguments with the climate denier trolls online, and that was like the one resource with Skeptical Science that kind of explained it in simple English, so that you didn't have to go to reference some jargony scientific paper.
I think you were really active on Yahoo Answers, right?
I was using Yahoo Answers, yeah, because I was using Yahoo Answers to learn, which is not necessarily the best forum to learn about anything really, because there's a lot of good information and a lot of bad information. So then I started.
Wasn't Yahoo Answers just shut down? Like
just recently shut down. Yeah.
Did they take down all the content or just deactivate it? Like,
I don't know.
Are all your answers still online?
I haven't looked at it in probably 10 years. So it was never the most useful resource, but it was, there was like a group of like climate realists who would try to give accurate information, and then a group of climate deniers who would try to give inaccurate information. And then every question, there was this kind of half answers were good and half answers were misinformation. And like the person asking the question got to choose which one was right. So it was not the best resource. And I don't think anybody's going to miss it too much, honestly.
Really loaded questions as well. Like, is Dana Nucitelli evil or something?
All the questions are very loaded because the person asking the question has a certain answer that they want to be given to them. If it's a polarized topic like climate change has become. Yeah. So that's where I was doing a bunch of answers there, and I was building my kind of common answers because all the questions would be the same. Like, is the sun causing global warming? Is it humans? Is it cosmic rays? They would always come up with the same questions. And so I kind of just like built up these documents with like, here are my resources to answer these questions that always come up. And then we're just talking about in 2010, somebody made a suggestion: you should build like basic, intermediate, and advanced level myth rebuttals on skeptical science to every myth. And so people are great at making suggestions, but not so great at actually contributing to making those suggestions come to fruition. And so you then had to put out the call. It's kind of the whole climate community. Can somebody help me build this resource? And I had these myth rebuttals already built up, like in Word documents. And so I was like, hey, what are these? How do these look to you? Can these work as like advanced rebuttals? And that's how I got involved in skeptical science. And at that point, it went from like a mediocre website to like a world-renowned, great resource. Right around that point, I think.
Yeah, I think that was the turning point. And I think that was also when we started calling you the cyborg as well.
That's probably right, yeah. What was that based on? Was that based on speed?
I don't know, just general productivity, or maybe just general Dana awesomeness, I'm guessing. But then when we did our 97% consensus study, and we were crowdsourcing, doing this content analysis where all of us were trying to read thousands of abstracts. It was this Herculean effort to get it all done. And I was trying to use every motivational tool possible to, like I was showing leaderboards and our overall progress, but also visualizing how every individual was progressing in terms of how many abstracts they were content analyzing. And everyone's wobbling around, on Tuesday they do 20, on Wednesday they do 40. You were this perfectly straight line. Every day you would do exactly 50 abstracts. And we were like, this proves it. He really is a scientist.
Yeah, so this was about 2012, 2013 when we decided to do our survey of the peer-reviewed literature and what it said about what's causing global warming, kind of building on Naomi Oreskes' 2004 smaller survey of the literature at the time. And so we had this whole team. We were like, this would be great. We can just crowdsource it to our team, which was a great use of skeptical science team resources. And I'm the kind of person, like, I have to set a certain amount or I'll just I'll get bored and stop doing it. So I'm like, I have to do 50 each day. And so it ended up being a straight line. That's just kind of how I operate, I guess. So then 2013, we published the consensus, what do we call it? The consensus project paper, the 97% consensus in the peer-reviewed literature that humans are causing global warming. 2013, that's also when I started writing for The Guardian. And probably around then is when you started your PhD work, right? In social or in cognitive science?
I think I started at the beginning of 2012. But you must have started your Guardian like after the 97 paper, because didn't you call it We Are the 97%?
Basically the same time as we were basically creating the blog. The paper was about to be published, and so I was like, this is like and at that point we kind of knew that consensus messaging, I think, was a good thing, a very effective way of kind of convincing people about, to accept climate science. And so I was like, we need to put this 97% consensus in our blog name somehow. And like one of the first, I think it was like a month after the blog went live, then the paper got published. And so one of the first pieces that I wrote for The Guardian was about the 97% consensus paper. So kind of the timing was really good for that.
And wasn't the title also you were tying into the We Are the 1% movement at the time?
We went through a few different name suggestions, and the Guardian editor shot a lot of them down because they were like too long or too complicated. So it ended up just being 97%. What was it? The 97% climate consensus? I can't even remember anymore. Just something simple about 97% consensus, because they're newspaper editors and they like to keep everything very brief.
The one thing I noticed once you started writing for The Guardian was, prior to that, I was always telling you that you needed to channel your inner Neanderthal when you do science communication, because you're just so smart that you it's almost like a curse of knowledge thing. You write at this level, and you just needed to
dumb it down.
Dumber in how you,
remember the KISS, keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that like just your writing style just got just more like just a better writer over the course of just doing those Guardian articles over and over.
Yeah, I mean, anything you do like on a weekly basis, you get better at. So yeah, I started with, did a bunch for Skeptical Science, and then I did a bunch for The Guardian, and you write a million different blog posts and you get pretty decent at it. Yeah, and I also remember like our early days. I remember at some point we had a conversation that we were saying Skeptical Science was inevitably going to become totally useless because, or totally outdated, because we're debunking all these myths, and surely everybody would accept all these myth debunkings and stop repeating the myths, and then like nobody would use Skeptical Science anymore. And then like around 2012, 2013, we realized that was pretty naive, because like we were making not very much progress in kind of beating back climate deniers. And so that's why I started writing more about policy and economics and politics. And then you went into cognitive science to try to figure out how psychologically to beat this information into people's heads, basically to get people to accept the scientific data.
Yeah, I mean, so my PhD went from 2011 to 2016, and it was focused on the cognitive science of denial. But towards the end, just as I came to the end of the PhD, I was thinking, yeah, obviously we were naive about thinking that skeptical science wouldn't become obsolete that very quickly. But even in 2016, I thought, well, Hillary's about to become president, and misinformation is kind of becoming socially irrelevant. So I accepted a job at George Mason University in Virginia in the middle of 2016, right. And I was going to come over in January 2017. And so as I was finishing my PhD, I was thinking, maybe I need to start branching out into other areas of climate communication, because Hillary will be bringing in all this climate policy, and no one will be talking about science denial anymore. It'll be all about policy. Yeah, I got to stop making predictions.
I feel like you're maybe about 4 years too early. Like now we're pretty much at that point where, I mean, there's a little bit of science denial, but for the most part, people don't take science denial too seriously anymore. And now it's all about like, it's too expensive, it's going to kill jobs. And it's all about kind of solutions denial instead of science denial. Like there's still a little bit of science denial out there, but it's gotten a lot less kind of purchase, I think, especially in the media. People kind of just, for the most part, ignore it at this point, which is good. It only took us a decade to get to this point. So I guess that's...
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly right. Like we're doing, we talked about how the skeptical science team did this content analysis of consensus papers. The next big content analysis thing we did was we spent several months training a machine to detect climate misinformation. And we've only just finished that research now. It's currently under review at a journal. And what we found in that research was once we trained the machine, We then poured 20 years of climate misinformation into it and got it to build a 20-year history of climate misinformation. And we found that there were two big trends in it that really jump out. One is that attacks on scientists was a much bigger category of climate misinformation than the science arguments. So all the stuff that skeptical science looks at was actually a minor part of climate misinformation. For us, it looms large, but in the grand scheme of things, it was not the big thing. Attacking scientists and attacking science models and attacking climate models and scientific measurements was a much bigger category. But the other big trend, and I think the key takeaway from that research, is that over this 20-year history, you see the proportion of misinformation targeting climate solutions is just getting bigger and bigger. And it's overtaken all the other categories, and it will just become increasingly the dominant part of climate misinformation now. So we really do need to get ahead of climate solutions, like myths, and just preemptively debunk them whenever possible, and just be coming up with more resources to push back against solutions denial.
Yeah, so we're moving through the stages of climate denial, right? Like, it's not happening, it's not bad, it's not us. And then it's like, did I get it backwards? It's not happening, it's anyway. And then like toward the end, it's like, it's too hard to solve, basically. That's kind of where we are now. We're like, the solutions are too hard, so they're too expensive. And so, but at least we're getting kind of, to the later stages of climate denial. So that's some progress, right?
Something. Yeah, I mean, like every stage, whether it's not us, it's not real, it's not bad, it's not us.
Yeah.
All of those conclude, therefore we shouldn't act on climate change.
Right, so, exactly. Yeah, the end conclusion is always the same. That's kind of the core behind climate denial, is not wanting to take action. And then you kind of build your arguments from that core. So speaking of which, since we're talking about stages of climate denial, I guess that kind of is a good transition for the Cranky Uncle. So why don't you tell us about your Cranky Uncle stuff?
Yeah, so over the course of my PhD, I found that there are really two major ways of pushing back against misinformation, either with facts or with logic. We call it fact-based corrections or logic-based corrections. Skeptical science is really fact-based corrections. It's showing how misinformation is wrong by explaining the science. But what my research just increasingly was pushing me towards was this logic-based approach, which is explaining the rhetorical techniques and the logical fallacies in misinformation. Because not only does it neutralize the misinformation, it can neutralize it across topics. In other words, like my first inoculation experiment, I inoculated people against the fake expert strategy used by the tobacco industry, and found that debunking tobacco misinformation actually inoculated people against that same technique in climate misinformation or the global warming petition project. So this logic-based, sort of critical thinking-based approach to debunking myths, it's kind of like a universal vaccine against misinformation. It can help people spot attempts to mislead them, regardless of the topic. And so my research ever since finishing my PhD has been, how do you put that into practice? How do you like effectively at scale inoculate people against misinformation? And maybe I should share my slides, because I have a couple of slides that kind of flesh this out a bit. For me to
go for
do that now. So are we seeing the flick slide okay?
Yep, we see it.
Right, so over the last decade, I've been building a taxonomy, or basically the landscape of different rhetorical techniques that you see in misinformation. And my starting point were the 5 techniques of science denial that Mark Hoofnagel first proposed in a blog post of his back, I don't even know what year it was, probably around 2011, maybe even earlier. And so these 5 techniques of science denial can be summarized with the acronym FLIC: fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. But they're just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole set of different rhetorical techniques and fallacies underneath that. And so I've been researching, well, how do you explain this to people? How do you communicate it? And just looking at this slide kind of makes it clear the challenge, because there's a lot to take in here. Not only to just get people aware of them in the first place, but then internalize them enough that they can spot them in the wild. You know, like how do you understand what a false analogy is or a false choice fallacy, understand it well enough to actually see that in real time and recognize it when you're watching Fox News or reading tweets or whatever. And so I've been struggling with that kind of psychological and education challenge. How do you get across this information and land it deeply enough that people can put it into practice in the real world? And there's some real psychological barriers there, because Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his work in psychology and economics, he talks about how humans have two ways of thinking: fast thinking and slow thinking. And almost all of our thinking is fast thinking. It's immediate reaction. It's our emotional gut instinct response. It's fast thinking is very quick and effortless. We just do it without even thinking, without even realizing that we're doing, coming to these conclusions based on these instant reactions. And then there's slow thinking, which is reasoning through complicated problems, like doing a 2x2 multiplication, or looking at an argument, trying to deconstruct the logic and identify what is the reasoning fallacy in that argument. Slow thinking is effortful and it's really difficult. And because of that difference, effortless versus effortful, almost all our thinking is quick thinking. And trying to teach people to do slow thinking, which is really the purpose of education, there's a limit to how much we can actually turn people into Socrates. In the real world, we can only get so far with that. So I've been struggling with this question: how do we turn people into slow thinkers? But then in Daniel Kahneman's book, he also talks about a third way of thinking, which he calls expert heuristics. Heuristics being mental shortcuts. And what he's talking about is when somebody performs a task over and over again, and they practice it enough that it goes from being a hard, effortful task to something quick and effortless. An example would be like a heart surgeon who's done decades of surgeries, so that they can assess a really complicated situation while they're operating and instantly know what to do just through that sheer practice. So how do we get people practicing critical thinking? And I kind of just accidentally stumbled on the answer just through my work and through serendipitously meeting an app developer at a misinformation conference in DC a couple of years ago. And we started developing a game that teaches the techniques of science denial. It uses humor, uses cartoons as a way to make the content engaging. But it also gets people practicing critical thinking and solving that slow thinking versus thinking problem. So the game is based on like we have in the misinformation research, a branch of psychological research called Inoculation Theory, which is you inoculate people against misinformation by explaining the rhetorical techniques, explaining the techniques used to mislead people. And usually inoculation is passive inoculation. You're explaining the techniques and people are passively receiving those explanations and getting inoculated. But there's also, just over the last few years, there's been a new line of research called active inoculation, which is basically using games to interactively teach people the techniques of denial. And basically you're kind of teaching them how to do the rhetorical techniques in order for them to be able to spot them. kind of like teaching someone how to cheat at cards so that they can spot other people trying to cheat at cards. And so this active inoculation approach is what the Cranky Uncle game does. Cranky Uncle is your mentor in the game, and he's teaching you how to become a science-denying Cranky Uncle yourself. And he basically explains those techniques of denial. So he'll take a technique of denial like anecdotes, using anecdotal thinking to mislead people. He explains what the technique is, and then the game uses cartoons and analogies to illustrate the techniques, give concrete examples of that bad logic. And so explaining the techniques of denial is one part of the game. And obviously, you need to get that foundation. But then what games offer that is particularly powerful is you can use all these gameplay elements like collecting points, leveling up, just those things that incentivize a player to try to get further into a game. And you can use those elements to incentivize players to practice critical thinking. And the way it works in the Cranky Uncle game is it shows you examples of misinformation, and you have to identify the denial technique in the example. And by doing that over and over, by practicing, the more you practice, the more that slow thinking, critical thinking task becomes a quick, effortless spotting the fallacy. You can see those patterns in different arguments and how they can be associated with different denial techniques or logical fallacies. So that's really it for the game. Explain the techniques of denial, practice spotting them. And the game came out in December. It took us, it was meant to come out in June 2020, and obviously the pandemic disrupted everything. We didn't end up finishing it until December. It came out on iPhone first, but in our defense, we actually submitted it to the iPhone store and the Google Play Store at exactly the same time. Google just took forever to review it, whereas Apple, to our surprise, reviewed it really quickly. And so the Android users, where's our game? Why is it on? iPhone users get all the fun. And there was even one conspiracy theory that we were intentionally only doing the game for iPhone because obviously iPhone users are all leftist communists. So I tried explaining, no, there's no conspiracy. Google are just slow in reviewing the game. And then a month or two after that, we also brought it out on browser so that our goal is to make the game as free and accessible to as many people as possible. And also a lot of classes, particularly middle school and high school are using the game in their classes to teach critical thinking. Often they can't use phones in the class, so having it on browser was important for that reason. So that's just the background I wanted to give on the Cranky game. Hopefully you've all had the opportunity to get those URLs. So I'll stop sharing.
And importantly, you drew all the cartoons for the Cranky Uncle app and book, right? And there's also a book we should mention.
Right, yes. Before I was a scientist, I was a cartoonist for a decade, which climate deniers always like to point out, thinking that makes me less credible. I think having artistic ability is actually quite a useful skill in terms of engaging the public about climate change. But so I was a cartoonist for 10 years. Then I did my PhD, and then at the end of my PhD, when I realized that using parallel arguments or analogies to explain logical fallacies was a powerful way of debunking myths, and cartoons were the perfect delivery mechanism for that. That was my Dorothy from Wizard of Oz moment when I realized that I had the ability to fight misinformation all along. I just had to realize it.
Nice.
I had to do 10 years of research before I realized, hang on a sec, I can do this.
Cool. Okay, so before we get to the questions, I have one more item to share. So this was back in 2014. My book was about to come out, and you did a brief interview with me. And I want to show a few clips from that just to show some representative samples of what that was like.
May I call you Scooter Boy?
You may not.
Your parents cure cancer while you create animated GIFs. Are your parents very disappointed in you? I think the correct answer is, I'm saving the world, you. So there you go. How was that?
Jesus Christ. So I've been waiting 6 years for the opportunity to get a little bit of revenge. So, John, I'm going to call you Kangaroo Boy. And my question is, are your parents ashamed that you're basically a glorified cartoonist?
Yeah, I was expecting something like this. Well, firstly, that little video excerpt you showed there used the fallacy of cherry picking. So just picking a little.
That was a totally representative sample.
I don't think it was, but okay. So I sent the Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change book to my dad as soon as it was published, like last year. And when he got it, I was on the phone with him and I said, "So, what did you think of the book, Dad?" And he said, "It's very colourful." That's the only feedback I've got from him about the book so far. And then I said to him, "You know, what did you think of the cartoon I drew of you in the book?" I think he's on page 13. And he says, "I haven't seen it." At that point, I realized I don't think he's actually read the book. He just kind of flipped through it. And I said, "Well, you got to read it." And he says, "Well, which part of the book is it in? The front half or the back half?" And I was like, "I'm not telling you where it is. Read the damn book." So maybe that answers your question.
Great family support. That's beautiful. All right, Brett, why don't we move on to the people's questions? Okay. First question, is it worthwhile to respond to climate denial comments on a Facebook post, or would it be better to ignore them? What do you think?
It depends on the context. My general rule of thumb on whether to engage with climate denial online is, can I turn that into a teachable moment? Is it misinformation where I can use my response to inoculate everyone else who's reading that page? Can I, like try to do that critical thinking inoculation approach and explain the fallacy in the misinformation? And the other factor is responding going to amplify the misinformation? It's kind of like, are you punching up or are you punching down when you respond to misinformation? If you're punching down, then you're probably going to just amplify them and do them a favor. So it's really a matter of weighing up those kind of factors before deciding whether to respond or not.
So is your target there the person who wrote the Facebook post, or the person's friends who are potentially reading the comments below the Facebook post?
One thing I learned from my PhD, and a lot of research has shown this, is you have almost no chance of changing a climate denier's mind. It's probably like 2% chance, I think one study showed. So my target is, the point of any engagement is not the climate denier, because you're not going to change their mind. Instead, it is everyone else watching the exchange. And this is the same as, like, if I'm giving a public talk and there's a climate denier in the audience and he's asking me a question during Q&A, the mindset I take responding is, and while I'm talking to them and I'm responding to them, I'm not thinking I'm going to change this person's mind. I'm really responding for everyone else who's watching the exchange and explaining how their misinformation distorts the science. What is the fallacy? What is the flick fallacy in their myth? And hopefully that will inoculate everyone else. And taking that approach is actually kind of, it's good for your emotional health as well, because trying to change the mind of a science denier is like beating your head against a brick wall. If you go into that exchange and not thinking, why won't you change your mind? But it's more, I'm going to calmly explain how your misinformation is misleading. You can be much more calmer And how you talk is just as important as what you're saying.
Yeah, and I'm always thinking about when it's Facebook or Twitter and I see something like that, I'm thinking like, if I respond, who is going to see my response? Like, does this person have enough followers to make it worthwhile, or am I just talking to a denier one-on-one, in which case I'm just like you said, I'm banging my head against the wall, and what's the point of doing it? Like, you need to find instances where your engagement is going to reach an audience that's going to be worthwhile.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, next question. How do you suggest we counter conspiracy theorists who don't trust any sources?
Yeah, so the answer is kind of the same in one sense as the first question, in that who is your audience? It's not the conspiracy theorists, it's everyone else. So again, your goal is to inoculate your people against the conspiracy theory. And that flip taxonomy with all the different sub-techniques has a whole section on conspiracy theories. If you Google the Conspiracy Theory Handbook, this was something I co-authored with Stefan Lewandowski, where we identify the 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking. And because I'm obsessed with acronyms, we came up with an acronym. Actually, I came up with the acronym on a flight from Australia to the US, like a 12-hour flight. About a third of it was spent just going through the 7 techniques and trying to tool them to come up. I was really keen to get tinfoil as the as the acronym, but I couldn't crack the L. So in the end, I went with conspire. So the 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking are contradictory. Often you'll find that conspiracy theorists believe 2 things that are completely contradictory, but they believe them at the same time. In climate denial, it'll be global warming is not here, is not real. Global warming is real and caused by the sun. You'll see the same person argue both. Conspire. So O stands for overriding suspicion, not believing, or not, just not believing any scientific sources. N stands for nefarious intent, believing that the conspirators are all evil and trying to deceive us, whether it's climate scientists who are faking the data or trying to take away our freedom or in it for the money. S stands for something must be wrong. Even if you can disprove part of a conspiracy theory, they still believe that the official account is wrong. And they still hang on to that conspiracy theory no matter what. P stands for persecuted victim. Conspiracy theorists are characters in their own conspiracy theory. They're the brave hero who's revealing the truth, and the conspirators are trying to suppress them and keep them from revealing the truth of the conspiracy theory to the world. I stands for immunity to evidence. It's that idea of not trusting any sources. Conspiracy. Oh, that's helpful. Thanks. So why you can't persuade a conspiracy theorist is because they distrust sources. Any evidence you give them that disproves the conspiracy theory, they actually interpret that as being part of the conspiracy theory. And we saw this in 2009, I think it was, when somebody hacked climate scientist emails from the University of East Anglia and published them online. It was called ClimateGate, which is a really unimaginative title, but all the emails were picked through, and they would find statements that cast like a negative light on the climate scientists as if they were faking data, climate data or whatever. But when there was an investigation, and there were 9 different investigations into the scientists and their emails to look at, were scientists actually faking scientific data? And every investigation concluded, no, there was no evidence that scientists were doing anything wrong. The way that the conspiracy theorists and climate deniers responded was they assumed that the investigators were part of the conspiracy. They were just whitewashing whatever bad activity of the scientists were. In other words, they were expanding their conspiracy to bring the investigators on. And any evidence disproving their conspiracy theory was assumed to be part of the conspiracy theory. And lastly, reinterpreting randomness. Generally, like humans are pattern detection machines. We all see shapes in clouds, or Jesus in a toasted cheese sandwich, or we see patterns everywhere. Conspiracy theorists take this to extremes. They'll just take any random events or random things and join causal links between them. 5G came out in 2019. COVID-19 came out in 2019. Aha, 5G must have caused COVID-19. Or there's a bio lab in Wuhan. COVID-19 originated in Wuhan. The bio lab must have been where the virus was engineered and released. So just taking random things that happen to be in close proximity and joining links between them. So reinterpreting randomness is a key trait of conspiratorial thinking.
Now,
and that was a very long way of saying, educating people about the red flags of conspiratorial thinking is a way to inoculate people against being misled.
I just need to point out, if you had used for reimagining in that last category instead of just R, you would have spelled conspire correctly in the acronym.
Sorry, what would the E be?
It's reinventing or reimagining.
Yeah, see, I'm an acronym purist though. I don't like it when people kind of cherry pick letters.
I'm a spelling purist. All right, let's go to the next question. I've read that presenting facts to people after they've been fed misinformation only makes them dig in and try even harder to rationalize their initial false view. And so instead, we should focus on inoculating them or pre-bunking. Is that correct?
Mostly no. Yes and no. All right. So firstly, let me talk about the idea of the backfire effect. So the backfire effect is where you debunk misinformation and people end up believing the misinformation even more after you're debunking. And actually, there was some research published in 2007, I think, by Norbert Schwartz, that found that if you debunk myths in the wrong way, you can actually reinforce the myth. And it was actually Stefan Lewandowski, the cognitive scientist, sending me that paper that opened my eyes to the psychology of debunking. And that email and that paper ended up being life-changing. It took me down that path of doing a PhD in cognitive science. But that paper, like back in 2007, was one of the first papers finding a backfire effect. And the interesting thing is, over the last decade, researchers have been trying to replicate the backfire effect and really struggling to find it. Just trying lots of different contexts and topics and techniques, and it only comes up in rare occurrences and more often than not, there is no backfire effect. And so last year, myself and about 24 other misinformation researchers published the Debunking Handbook 2020. And one of the reasons why we did it was just to clear up that the backfire effect is not the boogeyman that we once thought that it was. It's gotten a lot of press, and unfortunately, it's being used as justification for not responding to misinformation. Even Facebook, I've seen an interview with Zuckerberg where he said, yeah, we don't want to come up against misinformation on Facebook because it might backfire. That's unfortunate, because the greater danger is that we fail to respond to misinformation and leave it unchallenged, and that leaves the public vulnerable to misinformation. So the first part of your question is, I would not worry about the possibility of reinforcing people's beliefs. It's better to push back against misinformation than to leave it unchallenged. As for, is it better to pre-bunk? Is an ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure? Actually, once I thought, how many ounces in a pound? And I was trying to compare the analogy to the actual quantitative research, comparing pre-bunking to debunking. Pre-bunking being preemptively correcting misinformation, and debunking doing it after people have seen misinformation. And the research is mixed on that. Some researchers found pre-bunking is better. Others found debunking is better. We published a paper testing pre-bunking versus debunking on Instagram, but we also tried it with fact-based corrections, explaining the science versus logic-based. We found that debunking worked better with facts, but it didn't. Pre-bunking didn't. In other words, if you explain the facts to people and then they encounter misinformation later, the misinformation cancels out the facts. So recency matters. The last thing that people hear matters, and facts are vulnerable to misinformation. But we found that when you debunked or pre-bunked with logic-based corrections, explaining the fallacy in the misinformation, it worked equally either way. And so I guess the takeaway from that is how you debunk matters. Is it fact-based? Is it logic-based? And I don't think you can say universally pre-bunking is better. I think we often don't have control of that anyway, because we don't know whether we have no control over whether people have been exposed to misinformation or not. So I think generally we just need to get out there and push back against misinformation. And whether it's fact-based or logic-based, it's all important, but yeah, that's a complicated answer.
You got to work with the hand that you're dealt.
Indeed.
And if people are wondering how to ask or upvote questions, there's a URL at the top of the page there, polyev.com/CCL123. Go there. Okay, next question. Where did resistance to climate science come from? Is it mostly traced to the fossil fuel industry strategy, or is it simply human nature that some will create conspiracies, i.e., how can we overcome this once and for all? Solve the problem right now. Go.
Okay, I'll do it in 2 minutes or less. So firstly, it's not baked into the human condition that we have to be polarized about climate change. And we know that because not all countries are polarized to the same degree. The US polarization is obviously way higher than other countries. And B, even the US didn't used to be as polarized. The polarization has gotten worse and worse over time. So polarization has been engineered rather than just, it's not hardwired into human psychology. So where does resistance come from? There's a really good study by some of my colleagues at the University of Queensland, Matthew Hornsey. They did a survey of surveys. They did a meta-analysis of all the different studies into why people's attitudes about climate change. And they find that the biggest predictor or driver of climate denial is political ideology, political affiliation. And then the second biggest is political ideology. So who we belong to, what social group we belong to, is the biggest predictor of climate denial. And then our beliefs, our political beliefs, are the second biggest predictor. And obviously there's a lot of overlap between the two, but conceptually they're different. Fundamentally, humans are social animals, and what social tribe we associate with has a big, huge influence on our beliefs. And so the very short history of climate denial is it was less polarized in the 80s, but from the early 90s onwards, conservative think tanks started pouring misinformation into the public, and that gradually polarized the public. And they came at it from an ideological perspective, but they were funded and amplified by fossil fuel money. So it was this kind of unholy alliance between fossil fuel and ideological groups that created this polarized environment. And so I haven't solved the problem, but I've at least said where the problem came from.
Yeah, and now
I'm answering the question.
It's like, what team am I on, and what does my team believe? And that's what I'm going to believe. Okay, next one. How can we debunk/inoculate at scale? Lies seem to spread faster than facts. So how do we combat that? Cranky Uncle.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, Cranky Uncle is one answer to that. like I've been struggling with that question of scale, for years, and it's a problem because, firstly, the communities that are most hit with misinformation and misled are also the hardest to reach with the type of information that I produce. Like climate deniers on, or conservative communities are less likely to follow like me on Twitter, unless they're climate deniers who are trying to keep an eye on what I'm up to. And so like I can come up with the perfect inoculating message, but find it really hard to penetrate that into the siloed communities on social media or wherever. And so that kind of structural limitation has been one problem, and then scaling it up so you reach much more of the public. So I think it's a multifaceted, complicated problem where we do need lots of ways of getting that information out there. Like we need a grassroots movement of people who are inoculated themselves, but then able to get out there and respond to misinformation in social media. We do need people out there calling out misinformation when they see it. But we also need to be able to develop shareable content like memes or tweets or short articles or infographics. And inoculation does lend itself to very short infographics, including cartoons. Cartoons are very memeable and shareable. We've found that debunking misinformation with cartoons versus serious infographics are both equally effective, but the cartoons are more likely to be shared and commented on and liked, so they are more viral. But ultimately, I found that games do offer this unique thing. Not only do they have that gameplay element that gets people practicing critical thinking, I also found that educators are crying out for interactive educational resources. And even while I was just working on the game, we hadn't even released it, but we had a prototype that we were testing. I was finding that teachers or climate scientists who were teaching college classes were keen on using the game in their classes all over the country, where there was red states or blue states. And so that made me realize that classrooms are a really powerful way to reach those siloed communities that I otherwise could not have any way of reaching. And games seem to be something that educators are really crying out for. So I think that being creative and coming up with resources that, I guess my main model is come up with resources that other people will then take on board. That's the skeptical science model. We create these resources that CCL members or educators or scientists or climate activists can take and use in their own work. And that allows you to reach a much wider and more diverse group than you would if you were just doing the communication yourself.
Nice. Yeah, teach critical thinking early. All right, we got a few minutes left, so let's try to crank out a couple more questions. At the end of the day, very few scientists have done the firsthand research to know climate change is real. All of us have to trust someone. I know that the misinformers use, quote, science themselves. How can we know we're not trusting the wrong people? This awareness keeps me humble.
So I'm just getting confused because I just gave a talk 15 minutes before this talk where I talked about fake experts for 30 minutes, and then I just realized I haven't talked about it to you at all. So I just realized that I can't just, I mustn't get my presentations mixed up. But all right, one of the most effective denial techniques is fake experts or argument from false authority, which is presenting spokespeople who convey the impression of expertise but don't have any relevant expertise. It'll be like a social scientist talking about COVID. Like I saw that on TV once. Someone saying, I have a PhD in social science, so that's why I'm qualified to challenge Anthony Fauci about what he says about COVID. And I was like, well, I have a PhD in social science, but I'm not going to be mansplaining to Anthony Fauci about how COVID works. But unfortunately, that strategy is really persuasive because humans are social animals. We we look to other people's opinions, and people who convey the impression of expertise are very persuasive. And if we are shallow processors of information, someone who just shallowly conveys impression of expertise, doctor someone or someone from some serious sounding institute, without actually thinking, well, hang on a sec, is their discipline actually relevant to what they're talking about? If we don't take that extra time to do that slow thinking, that careful assessment of their expertise, then we're very in danger of being misled. So educating people about the fake expert strategy is important, and getting people to think, just give someone a second look to assess whether their expertise is relevant.
Okay, let's do one more question. Let me try to pick one here. Let's try this one. Do you think there's a difference in approach required for addressing skepticism that's based in political or social affiliations versus more of a pure skepticism?
It depends on if do you mean pure skepticism as in skepticism in the original sense, which is like skeptic movements, like the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, where skepticism is actually a good thing. It's about considering all the evidence before coming to a conclusion. If that's what you're talking about, then we should be endorsing skepticism, and we should be trying to disassociate the word skeptic with climate denial. That's why I never call climate deniers climate skeptics. It's bringing the word skepticism into disrepute and giving them more credit than they deserve. So if do you think that's what the question means, or something else?
Yeah, I think it's asking like, what kind of approach would you take if you're talking about somebody like that who's like a genuine skeptic versus somebody whose skepticism is more of like sort of tribally based, like I'm skeptical because I'm a conservative or something like that.
I guess there might be a case, for example, someone might be skeptical about whether to get vaccinated, not because Fox News is telling them that Bill Gates is trying to put a microchip in you, but you're just a little bit worried about side effects or something. So in that case, that's not an ideological skepticism. That's more, I guess that's a more pure or I think certainly the task is a lot easier if they're not ideologically driven. If they're ideologically driven, then you've got to just sort of cut your losses in a way and think, all right, I almost have no chance. Whereas if they're skeptical, like in a genuine sense, then facts, at least they're open to facts. And I think the fact-based or the logic-based approach can be effective in that context. So probably the difference in approach, I probably approach it the same way, but I would go into it with different expectations.
You'd be more optimistic talking to a genuine skeptic than an ideological skeptic.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, Brett, top of the hour. You got anything to close us out?
I do indeed. I just have one last slide to remind people after listening to find out about Cranky Uncle here with the website. From there, you can find all of the downloadable app links that Dr. Cook has created with his wonderful team. Another huge shout out again to the wonderful community that John and Dana and all of the Skeptical Science team have put together. I know for years that was the go-to and still is the resource for CCL advocates to really understand and help highlight a lot of the arguments and counter arguments going on there, within the climate change skeptical community. And outside of this, if you're hearing about CCL for the first time tonight, we'd love for you to join our movement. Citizens Climate Lobby is volunteer driven across this country, populated by all of us that are attending here tonight, including you. So check us out at cclusa.org/join. Tonight's recording will be available on our YouTube channel. That's available here. And you can also find a wonderful climate science basics course that we have. It's interactive. Our wonderful education and engagement coordinator, Tamara Staten, created that. Can't recommend it enough. Another wonderful way to kind of jump in to a lot of the information presented here. But I'll just close by thanking everyone for being here, and especially on behalf of all of us that are tuned in on YouTube and Zoom. Dr. Cook, thank you so much for making time. Obviously, you have a lot of other commitments right now, and the fact that you joined us really helped highlight a wonderful resource that us as CCL advocates, as climate advocates, and the people that are encountering these conversations in our own lives can benefit from and become more practiced. We are so grateful for that. And Dana, as always, it is wonderful to have your leadership and hosting on our quarterly AMA series and all the work you're doing with the Science Policy Network. So is there anything else that either of you would like to add as we close tonight?
Well, for me, just thanks very much for the invitation to speak. Thanks, Dana, for that question. It's obviously been on your chest for the last half decade or so.
Years.
And thanks to CCL, like what you guys do is incredibly important. And just keep up that great work and stay the course.
Thanks, Dana.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Good to see you,
Thank you. This is really far out.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.